Recently, I came across a discussion online. Somebody was asking for advice. By the way, this was a grown adult, but he had watched a horror movie about 10, 11 months before, and even after all that time, he was finding it really hard to sleep. And the replies to this guy's post were very, very sympathetic. One person remembered a particular movie he had watched, and he said that for hours and hours after he had watched this, he just sat there on his sofa. He just would not get up. And he says, in fact, he was absolutely bursting for the bathroom, but he still wouldn't go because he was terrified. He just couldn't bring himself to walk into his landing because he was frightened about what might be around the corner. Somebody else confessed that he had watched a horror movie several weeks before, and he had been sleeping with the light on ever since. Now, I have to say, I'm not into horror movies, so the only real advice I could give is maybe don't watch it in the first place if it's going to affect you like that. But I do know that if ever there was a man who had every reason to sleep with the light on, it was probably Daniel. He spent the last few chapters, hasn't he, being shown really, really scary things. He's seen wars, he's seen persecution, he's seen a world in turmoil. He has been told about one of the most vile, despicable men who has ever lived. And then he's been told about somebody who's going to come after him and is going to wreak even more havoc. And yet, one of the things that I find really interesting about this last chapter is that Christ gives Daniel a simple instruction. Maybe you noticed it as we read through the chapter. He tells Daniel to do something twice. Verse 9 and verse 13. Go your way. In other words, don't just sit on your sofa, too scared to go upstairs. Don't be so petrified by what you've seen that you can't get on with everyday life. Go your way. Just get on with it. And surely the same instruction is meant for us. Go your way. Keep on going. And in one sense, we're not being called in this passage to get all fired up. We're not being called to get out there and change the world. You'd maybe expect that the book would end with that sort of crescendo, but it doesn't. We're not being called to get out there and take the fight to the bad guys. We're simply being called to keep on going and to keep on slogging along, to keep on living life, to keep on putting one foot in front of the other, to keep on being faithful in those small, everyday moments of life. And to help us keep on going, to help us go our way, we're going to look at a number of different encouragements in this chapter. 4 different encouragements. So first of all, go your way because God delivers his people. Go your way because God delivers his people. Now, thankfully, we are not likely to face the sort of really awful persecution that Daniel has been told about in chapter 11. And yet, probably all of us at some point, actually multiple points in life, we're going to have to make some sort of sacrifice for our faith. And so I think we should be encouraged by what we see at the start of this chapter. Remember, last time around, when we were on chapter 11, we saw the Antichrist. We saw this really, really powerful enemy of God's people. This figure who is determined to just crush the true faith and attack God's people. But notice, he's not the only one on the scene. Chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people will arise. Now, Michael appears several times in the Bible. He seems to be one of God's really powerful, really trustworthy heavenly servants. But more importantly than who Michael is whom Michael serves. He serves God. God appoints him to protect his people. And that should encourage us. Maybe you have questions about the mechanics, questions that I probably can't really answer. Maybe God uses Michael sometimes, maybe sometimes he uses someone else, maybe other times God just acts in a more direct way or in a different way, but surely we see the principle in this verse that God delivers his broken, hurting, hard-pressed people. And yet, as we've seen in chapter 11, this deliverance does not mean that we don't have to suffer. I suppose you could say, rather than God delivering us from trial, God delivers us in trial. Some of you maybe are familiar with the story of the two Margarets in Scotland in the 1600s. They were both Covenanters, so they have a close connection with our own church. And both Margarets were arrested by the king's men. They were arrested because they had been going to illegal worship services. They were Christians, they wanted to worship in God's way. And both Margarets were sentenced to death by drowning. So they were taken to the sea, the tide was out, and they were tied to wooden poles. And the idea is, as the tide comes in, it's going to get higher and higher until eventually they drown. One of the two ladies was a bit older, so she was tied further out. And the idea was, whenever the younger Margaret saw what happened to her, whenever she saw her drowning, she would cry out for mercy. She would do whatever the soldiers wanted her to do. She would turn her back on her faith and she would be saved. The question is, what happened next? Because we're told here God delivers his people. So does that mean God sent a great big wind to blow the sea away so that she wouldn't drown? Does that mean that God sent an angel from heaven to kill the soldiers and fly her off to safety? Well, no. She saw the first Margaret die, and then the waves swept over her as well, and she died, and she was 18 years old. And so the question is, how did God deliver her, if that's what happened? Well, some of you might know the story. Even though she was only 18, she faced death with incredible courage, didn't she? As the water crept up her body, one of the soldiers grabbed hold of her. He held her head above the water and he gave her one last chance. And he said to her, if you just turn your back on your faith, we'll cut you free. We'll let you live. And this girl, 18 years old, she said, no, I am one of Christ's children. Let me go. And surely, in her bravery, we see God bringing deliverance, don't we? Think of how easily she could have given up. Think of how easily she could have betrayed Jesus Christ. Think of how she would have regretted that for the rest of her life. And yet, surely, in this moment of the most crushing, most intense pressure you can possibly imagine, surely God strengthened her. Surely God delivered her so she was able to stand firm. And surely, as people who love the Lord Jesus, surely that is the sort of deliverance that we want more than anything else. Maybe some of us are going to be in particular need of that deliverance. Maybe some of us are going to have to withstand incredibly intense pressure if we're going to stand firm. Maybe for some of us it's going to be because of the hatred of the world. Maybe for some of us it's going to be because we accept what the Bible has to say about maybe some of the really contentious issues that our world loves to talk about. Maybe because of that, some of us are going to have to make really difficult choices in years to come. I'm assuming none of us are going to have to give our lives, but we might have to give our jobs, or our friendships, or our respect. Surely this passage is telling us whoever we have to stand against, whether it is Antiochus Epiphanes, whether it's the Antichrist, or a belligerent colleague, or an antagonistic lecturer, or even the courts of the land, surely if we are the people of Jesus Christ, whether he does it through Michael, or whether he does it by some other way, surely he is going to give us the deliverance we need so we can stand firm. And by the way, surely that is also true of everyday life, just as much as it's true of opposition. Christ may not deliver us from these things, but he'll surely deliver us in sickness, in loneliness, in depression, in childlessness, in unemployment. Surely he will enable us to stay faithful even as we pass through those things. And so, like Daniel, you can go your way, you can get on with living life, because Christ delivers us in trial. Secondly, go your way because God vindicates his people. Go your way because God vindicates his people. Notice verse 3. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens. Now, that is a throwback to chapter 11, verse 33. We read there about those who are wise, and we see in that verse, those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. So we see in that verse that in those times of real serious persecution, the verse is speaking specifically about the times of Antiochus Epiphanes, but everybody else seems to be running scared, and there's this small minority of people who are standing firm. These people say, whatever the consequences might be, we are going to stay faithful to the one true God. Now, they're described as the wise, but they can't have seemed to be very wise at the time. It reminds me of a very famous photo. It was taken in Nazi Germany in 1936. Hitler had gone to visit a shipyard, and there were speeches, and as you might expect, all of the workers were giving the Hitler salute. And yet, right in the middle of this crowd, at the exact moment this photo was taken, there was one man, and he was standing there with his arms folded. And there's a bit of debate about who this man might be, but the man who I think the evidence really points to was actually a Christian. And the very reason why he wouldn't give the salute and he didn't get into any of the Nazi stuff is because his faith told him that that was wrong. And he was constantly being told how foolish he was. He was constantly being told, if you're not careful, you're going to end up in a prison camp or worse. You need to toe the line. Really, to his colleagues, to his boss, he was anything but wise, wasn't he? He was incredibly foolish. And yet, today, people look at that photo, don't they? No one calls him foolish. He's been completely vindicated. And surely it's the same with the people of Jesus Christ. Those believers who stood up to Antiochus Epiphanes and they lost their lives, they were called foolish. The Covenanters who kept on going to illegal services even though the king's men were on the hunt, they were called foolish. Christians today in Eritrea or parts of Nigeria, they're called foolish, aren't they? And no doubt some of us here, all of us here perhaps, we are seen as being foolish, aren't we? We're seen as being intolerant or narrow-minded or arrogant. You're called foolish because you don't cut corners at work. You're called foolish because here you are wasting your Sunday night, a lovely warm Sunday night, sitting in church. You're foolish because you're not making the most of life while you still can. And yet, does the Lord Jesus not point us forward here to vindication? Verse 3, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Yes, we might be unloved today. We might have our motives unfairly questioned. We might be written off as people who are stuck in the past. But that's just for now. Vindication. Magnificent, wonderful vindication lasts forever. Go your way because God vindicates his people. Thirdly, go your way because God glorifies himself. Go your way because God glorifies himself. So we've seen all this pain, we've seen all this opposition over the last number of chapters, and now there is this really big burning question in chapter 12 about what we've just seen. And the question is, how long? See it, for example, in verse 6. And notice that we're given part of the answer in verse 7. It will be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. Now, at first glance, that doesn't really sound terribly encouraging, does it? We would rather that God step in before the power of the holy people is completely broken. We would far rather not have to face that pain. And yet, surely that is so often the way in which God works. Think, for example, of the Exodus. Imagine if God had rescued his people, 100 years before he did. 50 years before he did. Imagine God had rescued his people just as things were starting to heat up. God wouldn't have had to take the drastic measures that he did. He wouldn't have had to send the plagues. He wouldn't have had to tear apart the Red Sea. If Israel was still relatively strong, it would have been a breeze, wouldn't it? And yet, if God had stepped in sooner, the history books would look very different, wouldn't they? They wouldn't show us God's incredible power over creation and sending the plagues. They wouldn't point us to Jesus Christ's deliverance of his people from slavery in the way that they do. But by waiting until Israel were broken, miserable slaves, God showed us his glory, didn't they? We were thinking about the Antichrist last week. He was able to inflict an unbelievable amount of darkness on Europe and further afield several hundred years ago. I wonder, why did God allow that? Why did he allow his own word to become suppressed? Why did he allow those who hold to the true gospel to feel completely alone? Was it not surely to show us that the bringing of the light wasn't simply down to Luther or Calvin or any other human being? It's down to someone far more powerful. I wonder, is that why God has allowed Ireland to turn so dramatically away from what is right? Is that why he has allowed the referenda of the last number of years to go the way in which they did? Is it to show that the growth of the church, or even just the survival of the church, it's not down to us, and it's not down to preachers, it's not down to elders, it's down to him and him alone? And on a personal level, does that maybe explain some of the really painful things that we have to go to as followers of Jesus Christ? Chronic disease, depression, just garden variety physical weakness. Because whenever we go through those things and whenever we stay faithful, it is so obviously not to do with some inner strength which we have. It's so obviously not down to us. And God uses us in our weakness to display his glory. And so that's the third encouragement this evening. Go your way because God reveals his glory. Fourthly and finally, go your way because the finish line is in sight. Go your way because the finish line is in sight. One of the things that we have seen over and over again in the book of Daniel is that Jesus Christ is in control. That's really the central message of the book. And so it's fitting that we see it again, and it's fitting actually that we close with that theme. Notice that Christ sets out the future for us, and notice that in verse 11 and verse 12 he goes into incredible detail. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. I'd imagine you have questions. Are these numbers literal? Are they symbolic? Are they both, even perhaps at the same time? Not going to go into those questions, but rather I want to make one really obvious point. The Lord Jesus has measured how long this hardship is to last in days. Because he could have said around about 3.5 years. But he doesn't. Surely he wants us to know that he has measured all of these things precisely. I saw some video recently of a brain surgeon. The brain surgeon was wearing those little magnifying lenses on his glasses, and the whole point of those lenses is so that he doesn't cut even 1 millimeter too far to either side of where he's supposed to cut. But surely that's like the Lord Jesus, isn't it? 1,290 days. Not a day more, not a day less. And then the finish line. And what's across that line? Well, we see it in verse 2. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. There's a warning here. If you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, the finish line for you is not a cause for celebration. The finish line means everlasting contempt. It means judgment that never, ever ends. But for those of us who are followers of Christ, just think of the relief that we are going to feel as we cross that tape. Think of the sweetness, the beauty of our everlasting life. Life and riches that Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist, the most hateful person that you will ever meet, will never be able to take away. Go your way. Keep on putting one foot in front of the other in faith. Because what God says to Daniel in verse 13, he says to you, and he says to me as well. Go your way till the end. You will rest. And then, at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance.